The midday sun scorched the dusty streets of Dry Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1883. The wind whipped tumbleweeds across the boardwalks, carrying whispers of a girl who had wandered into town with nothing but ragged skirts and eyes full of fear. The saloon doors swung open with a creak, spilling light and murmurs into the street as a lone cowboy rode into town. Boots kicking up dust and spurs clinking with each stride. He was tall, rugged, and silent, known to the townsfolk only as the man who never stayed, the man who carried storms in his eyes. Yet, as he tethered his horse outside the general store, a faint cry cut through the murmur of gossip and the rattling of barrels. A young woman crouched near the bakery, her hands trembling, her lips dry, holding out a torn handkerchief like an offering. Hunger etched deep lines into her once smooth face, and yet something stubborn lingered in her gaze. A spark that refused to die. "She's trouble," whispered the butcher, glancing toward the cowboy. "Or she's cursed. Ain't no girl begging for bread this far from a farm, not unless the world's gone cruel." The cowboy's eyes met hers. A gust of wind stirred the dust and carried the faint scent of burning wood from a nearby chimney. He sensed in an instant that this encounter would not be fleeting, that this girl, with her desperate courage, would ignite a fire in a heart he'd long tried to keep cold. And the town of Dry Creek would never forget the day he rode in, alone, and found more than supplies. He found a story that demanded to be lived. The midday sun beat down on Dry Creek with a relentless heat, turning the dirt streets into a shifting golden haze. Dust swirled around the boardwalks as the wind tugged at the faded signs of the general store and the saloon, rattling windows and stirring whispers from the townsfolk. Luke Callahan rode slowly into town, his boots scuffing against the wooden planks, spurs jingling with each deliberate step. His hat shaded eyes that had seen more miles and sorrow than most men dared to carry, and his coat flapped against the rising wind like a dark banner of solitude. He dismounted near the bakery, letting the reins fall loosely over his calloused hands, eyes scanning the town with a careful, practiced caution. From the corner of his vision, a small figure crouched in shadow, her skirts muddy and torn, a hand outstretched with trembling fingers toward a pile of bread scraps. She lifted her gaze when she noticed him, amber eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear, and Luke felt the faint pull of something he had long buried, a fragile, inexplicable concern. The scent of fresh-baked bread drifted from the bakery door, mingling with the arid wind and dust, an aroma both cruel in its teasing and comforting in its promise. "Please," she whispered, voice cracked, barely audible over the creaking of the saloon doors, and Luke's jaw tightened. The townsfolk leaned from doorways, murmuring among themselves. "That girl's trouble," the butcher muttered, wiping his hands on a stained apron. "Ain't no one begs in these parts without a story dark enough to twist your heart." Another woman, balancing a bucket of water, shook her head. "She came from over by the Harper farm. Poor thing must have run off something awful." Luke's eyes didn't leave hers as he stepped closer, boots sinking slightly in the sun-baked dust. His fingers brushed the reins, his presence both cautious and commanding, a silent promise that danger would not reach her while he remained. Emily flinched at his approach but did not retreat, a stubborn defiance lurking beneath the thin veil of fear. "Here," he said, pulling a loaf from the sack he carried, the crust warm and firm. He set it gently at her knees, letting his hand linger a moment longer than necessary before withdrawing. She blinked at the offering, her lips parting in a tentative smile, and for a heartbeat, the wind stilled, and even the gossiping townsfolk seemed to pause. Luke nodded once, sharp and decisive, then turned his gaze down the empty street, alert for any shadow that might threaten. The girl picked up the bread, her fingers brushing his for the briefest instant, a silent acknowledgement that passed between them. Timid, fleeting, but charged with unspoken understanding. He watched as she sank to the ground, clutching the loaf to her chest like a treasure reclaimed from the cruelty of the world. Dust whipped across the street again, tugging at hair, skirts, and hats, as if to remind them both that the frontier was no gentle place. Luke's jaw tightened. He could feel the eyes of every townsperson burning into his back, some suspicious, some curious, all aware that a story was unfolding they had yet to understand. Emily's breathing slowed as she nibbled at the bread, the warmth of sustenance filling her chest and driving away the icy fear that had lodged there for months. Luke adjusted his coat, the leather stiff and familiar beneath his hands, feeling the pull of a protector he had long denied himself the right to feel. The wind shifted, rattling the sign of the general store, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from a nearby chimney. And in that simple gust, he sensed the fragile threads of a bond beginning to form. Emily looked up again, eyes meeting his across the dust-laden street, and for a moment, no words were needed. He gave a subtle tilt of his hat, a gesture acknowledging both caution and a promise, before he stepped back toward his horse. The town resumed its rhythm, murmurs rising once more, but Luke's presence lingered in the girl's mind like a quiet storm, a mixture of threat and hope. She hugged the bread closer, warmth seeping through her fingers, and allowed herself the briefest whisper of relief. Luke mounted slowly, the horse snorting beneath him, ears flicking at the sudden stir of wind, and as he kicked his heels lightly, the animal began to move, stirring up clouds of gold dust that swirled around the corners of the town. He spared one last glance toward Emily, who crouched near the bakery, still clutching the bread, and in that gaze lay a silent question, a fragile invitation into a story neither of them could yet predict. The wind carried whispers, laughter, and the scent of bread through the street as Luke guided his horse down the main path. The small bond formed in that fleeting exchange, holding the weight of unspoken possibilities. The sun dipped slightly, casting long shadows across the boardwalks, painting the town in amber and gold, as if the frontier itself held its breath for the tale just beginning. In that pause between gusts of wind, between town gossip and the crackle of sun-heated wood, a subtle truth lingered. Two lonely hearts had collided in a dusty town, and nothing would be the same again. Rain hammered the prairie like a drum, each drop a sharp percussion against the tin roof of Luke's sparse cabin. The wind tore at the shutters, rattling them violently, and gusts whipped mud and debris across the narrow path from the main street. Emily huddled beneath the brim of her soaked hat, arms wrapped around herself, teeth chattering despite her thin, threadbare coat. Luke had spotted her struggling through the storm from the edge of town and guided her here without a word, his spurred boots slipping in the mud as he moved with purposeful urgency. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine smoke and worn leather, the crackling fire in the hearth offering a reprieve from the cold that gnawed at her bones. He handed her a rough wool blanket, letting it brush against her soaked sleeves. "Here," he said softly, voice low but steady, a contrast to the roar of the storm outside. Emily accepted it with a shy nod, wrapping it around her shoulders, the warmth seeping into her chest like sunlight breaking through clouds. Luke pulled a chair close to the fire and began drying his own coat, the rhythmic swish of water on cloth blending with the crackle of flames. Silence stretched, broken only by the storm's fury, until Emily whispered, I didn't think I'd make it." Her voice trembled, heavy with fatigue and fear. Luke glanced at her from beneath his hat, eyes softening. "You're safe now," he replied, letting the words hang in the firelight. The tension between them ebbed slightly, a fragile bridge forming in the small space between chair and hearth. The rain pounded harder, tapping on the roof and window panes like the hands of some invisible drum, echoing the turmoil in Emily's heart. She drew a deep breath, allowing the scent of burning pine and warm breadcrumbs Luke had left on the table to calm her. He offered a small piece of dried meat, and when she hesitated, he smiled faintly. "Eat. You'll need strength if you want to stay dry." Their fingers brushed briefly as she took it, the contact brief but electric, a subtle promise neither fully acknowledged. Hours passed in quiet companionship, the storm outside a mirror to the tumult of their thoughts and memories. Emily spoke haltingly of the farm she had fled, of nights spent hungry and cold, of a father whose fists and anger left more than scars on her spirit. Luke listened, eyes distant at first, then attentive, leaning forward, letting her words settle into the cracks of his own lonely history. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost confessional. "I've been wandering longer than I care to admit." "Never stayed long, never let anyone close." He paused, eyes catching the flicker of the firelight. "Guess I'm tired of being alone." Emily's lips curved in a tentative smile, warmth creeping into her damp cheeks. They shared more food, simple gestures of care, passing a bowl of stew, adjusting a blanket over shoulders, offering dry cloths to wipe rain from hair. Each act was small, intimate, and quietly monumental. The storm began to howl more insistently, rattling the cabin's walls and testing the seams of the roof. Luke's hand hovered near Emily's shoulder, an unspoken invitation of protection, of trust, until she finally leaned into it, just enough to feel anchored. Shadows flitted outside, branches bent under the wind, hints of townsfolk moving cautiously, and distant murmurs of those who still sought her. But the cabin's warmth and the crackling hearth created a fragile sanctuary. Emily's eyes grew heavy, lulled by safety and the steady presence of the man who had offered it. Luke moved to stoke the fire again, sparks flying up the chimney, golden in the dim light. A gust rattled the door, and Emily shivered, but he slid a chair closer, motioning for her to rest. She settled against the blankets, head tucked, eyes fluttering closed for the first time in months. Luke watched her with an unfamiliar tenderness, the storm outside still roaring but the space inside now a haven, firelight dancing across her relaxed features. He adjusted the blanket once more, brushing a damp strand of hair from her face, and sat back, silent, letting the rhythm of the rain lull them both into quiet reflection. Trust, fragile and tentative, had begun to root, and in the crackling warmth, an unspoken understanding grew. They were no longer alone. Even as the world beyond the cabin's walls raged on, the trail stretched endlessly across the sun-scorched plains, dust curling into the air with each step of Luke's horse as he guided Emily along the rugged path. The wind tugged at her skirts and hair, carrying the faint scent of wild sage and the dry earth beneath their hooves. Luke rode slightly ahead, glancing back with an easy caution, noting the tight grip Emily kept on the reins. Her fingers brushed the worn leather of her saddle, trembling slightly, and when she adjusted her posture, their hands brushed, brief, accidental, and electric, before she quickly looked away, cheeks tinged with warmth. Conversation was sparse at first, punctuated by the occasional clink of spurs or the low snort of their horses, but gradually, tentative words became laughter. Small stories of childhood farms, distant towns, and fleeting hopes. The trail narrowed as cliffs rose sharply on one side, the drop sheer and unforgiving, sending dust spiraling off the edges like a warning. Luke's horse stumbled slightly on loose gravel, and instinctively he reached out to steady Emily, his palm pressing against hers over the reins. "Easy," he murmured, voice calm, grounding. And she inhaled, letting the fear dissolve into the rhythm of the animal's steps. The afternoon sun burned orange across the horizon, painting the vast plains in streaks of molten fire, illuminating the sweat on their brows, and the dirt streaked across Emily's face. They paused to water the horses at a small creek, the sound of splashing water and wind creating a private sanctuary. Luke handed her a piece of jerky, and she smiled, biting cautiously, her laughter spilling into the air with ease, mingling with the distant rustle of leaves. Their path soon led them into taller grass where snakes slithered unseen. A sudden hiss startled Emily, and she jerked backward, horse skidding in protest. Luke caught her arm, steadying both her and the animal, his fingers lingering just long enough to send warmth racing through her veins. A stampede erupted unexpectedly, cattle thundering down the slope, hooves pounding and dust erupting into a choking cloud. Instinct took over. Luke grabbed the reins of Emily's horse while she clung to his arm, the two moving as one, shouting commands to keep animals from trampling the smaller path. Adrenaline surged, hearts hammering in sync with hooves and thundering cattle. When the chaos subsided, they collapsed near the edge of the trail, chest heaving, clothes caked with mud and sweat, exchanging a look that needed no words. The closeness felt different now, deeper, charged with shared survival and the unspoken acknowledgement of trust. By the time they reached a small trading post, the townsfolk eyed them curiously, whispers trailing like smoke. "Looks like the Cowboys found himself a companion," someone muttered from behind barrels of grain. Emily felt a flush of both embarrassment and warmth, realizing that Luke was no longer just a protector, but a partner on this vast, unpredictable frontier. Sunset bled across the plains, streaking fire-red and gold across the sky, and the wind tugged insistently at Emily's hair, whipping strands across her face. Luke reached out, brushing a curl from her temple, fingers lingering as if reluctant to let go. They shared a quiet meal, bread and cheese, water and jerky, the simple acts of passing food and adjusting blankets carrying more intimacy than words could muster. As twilight descended, lanterns flickering along the distant trading post, they rode back toward camp, the silence between them comfortable, filled with the unspoken promise of companionship and care. Stars began to prick the darkening sky, pinpoints of silver against the indigo, and Emily allowed herself a rare relaxation, leaning slightly against Luke's shoulder as their horses walked the final stretch. The prairie hummed softly in the night, the whisper of wind through grass, the distant cry of coyotes, the faint rustle of animals settling in the dark. And beneath that vast, open expanse, both hearts began to intertwine. Luke's gaze swept the horizon, then rested on Emily, faint warmth in his eyes. A silent question. Could this tenuous thread of trust and fledgling affection survive the wilderness, the dangers that trailed them, and the unspoken shadows of the past? Emily met his look with a quiet nod, a tiny smile curving her lips, and in that shared silence, a fragile hope took root. The night deepened, cool and quiet, and together they rode beneath the stars, the vast prairie around them echoing their tentative step toward belonging, toward love, toward the possibility that they might not be alone after all. The sun had barely touched the horizon when the first shadows of pursuit crept along the edges of the trail, dark shapes melting into the tall grasses like predators waiting for a moment of weakness. Luke and Emily rode cautiously, senses straining, ears catching the faint rustle of movement that didn't belong to the wind. Emily's hand trembled slightly as it brushed against Luke's on the reins, an unspoken plea and a silent acknowledgement of the danger looming behind them. A sudden shout cut through the evening air, rough, angry, and relentless, and Luke's horse bolted instinctively, dragging him just short of losing balance. Emily's cry joined the wind as the first pursuers emerged, riding hard and shouting threats that sliced through the twilight. Without hesitation, Luke guided them toward the gully he had memorized earlier, the narrow path winding down into a shallow creek bed, rocks slick and treacherous. "Stay close," he whispered, voice taut, eyes scanning for the next advantage. Rocks were dislodged strategically, sending small landslides to slow the attackers, and a hidden tangle of brush caught the lead rider's horse, throwing him momentarily off course. Emily's chest heaved, eyes wide as the danger passed in a blur of dust, hoofbeats, and flying gravel. "I'm sorry," she breathed, shaking. "I shouldn't have brought this on you." Luke's gaze softened as he reached out, steadying her trembling hands on the reins. "Hey," he murmured, tone firm yet gentle. "You didn't bring it on me." "I'm here, aren't I?" Their horses shied again as more movement stirred behind them, but Luke's mind raced, calculating terrain, wind, and the element of surprise. By splitting their path and doubling back through a dense copse of trees, he led Emily through shadows and underbrush, the attackers slowed by branches whipping their faces and the uneven forest floor. Eventually, the pursuers gave up, their shouts fading into the distance, leaving the forest heavy with the scent of pine, sweat, and dust. Emily slid from her horse, knees weak, and Luke wrapped a protective arm around her, brushing a damp strand of hair from her rain-slicked forehead. "You're safe," he whispered again, though both knew the night could still bring new threats. They made camp in a small clearing, fire crackling low against the encroaching darkness, smoke curling like a shield toward the heavens. Luke cleaned a shallow cut along Emily's forearm, hands steady, careful, his touch lingering in a way that communicated more than words. She shivered, not entirely from cold, as he wrapped the wound with a strip of cloth, murmuring reassurances she could feel in her chest more than hear. Nightfall pressed in from all sides, cloaking the forest in uncertainty, the shadows flickering with each flare of firelight, a mirror to the fears they both carried. They shared a small meal, bread broken in silence, the simple act of nourishment grounding them, a moment of warmth and intimacy amidst the lingering adrenaline. Emily glanced at Luke, eyes shining in the firelight, seeing not just the protector who had saved her, but the man who had become a tether, a presence she depended on and trusted beyond caution. I know you," she murmured, voice fragile. Luke shook his head, a faint smile brushing his lips. "No thanks needed, just don't let your guard down again," he said, though the warning lacked its usual severity, softened by the concern etched in his expression. Hours passed as they huddled near the fire, watching embers float upward, carrying away pieces of fear and doubt. Each rise and fall of the flames was a reminder that danger was ever present. Yet so was survival, and in their quiet companionship, the first threads of love began weaving into the fabric of their shared experience. Luke's hand rested near hers on the log where they sat, fingertips brushing accidentally but deliberately, a subtle admission neither had voiced aloud. Emily leaned into him just enough to feel the warmth seeping from his coat, the tension of the day melting into fragile comfort. Dawn hinted at the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and tentative golds, signaling both the end of the night and the possibility of renewal. The forest seemed to exhale with them, the threat temporarily subdued, leaving them battered but resolute, and bound together not just by necessity, but by a deepening attraction that neither could deny. Luke caught her gaze as the first rays lit her hair, golden in the morning light, and for the first time words were unnecessary. The understanding between them needed no articulation. In that still, tender moment, amidst the lingering scent of smoke and wet earth, they both knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it side by side, hearts tethered by trust, courage, and the subtle but undeniable stirrings of love. The morning sun spilled over the horizon, turning the plains into a canvas of gold and amber as Luke guided Emily along the path to the small, weathered homestead they had claimed together. The air smelled of fresh-turned earth, rich and sweet beneath the faint tang of sagebrush. Their horses plodded steadily, hooves sinking into soft soil recently tilled in preparation for planting, a rhythm both grounding and intimate. Emily's fingers brushed against Luke's as she handed him a spade, a spark of warmth passing between them unnoticed by the grazing cattle and distant wind. They worked side by side, breaking clumps of earth, planting seeds in neat rows, each movement carrying a subtle harmony that mirrored the quiet synchronization of their growing hearts. The scent of bread baking from the small kitchen in the cabin wafted across the yard, drawing Emily inside briefly to gather a warm loaf, golden crust crackling under her careful fingers. Luke followed, eyes softening as he watched her laugh, a sound that had been absent for far too long, spilling freely now into the morning air, mixing with the chirp of birds and the distant whistle of the wind. They carried tools, baskets of fresh vegetables, and woven blankets back and forth, sharing tasks and quiet gestures, a hand on a shoulder, a brush of damp hair from the forehead, a gentle squeeze of a gloved hand when elbows brushed while lifting heavy sacks of soil. Townsfolk began to take notice, leaning over fences, whispering as they watched the once lone cowboy and the timid girl forge a life together in the harsh, untamed landscape. "Looks like they're making more than just a farm," murmured one neighbor, the corners of his mouth lifting in a rare smile. Emily paused, wiping sweat from her brow, glancing at Luke, who offered a small, quiet nod that spoke volumes of partnership, trust, and the slow thawing of walls built over years of solitude. Afternoon light softened, painting the land in muted gold, and the two moved to mend the rickety fence at the edge of the property. Their hands met over the hammer and nails more than once, a silent dance of cooperation and subtle attraction. The day passed in gentle rhythm, feeding animals, sowing vegetables, carrying water from the well, laughing over minor mishaps, exchanging stolen glances that spoke of unspoken feelings. As dusk approached, the sky deepened to violet and rose, and Luke and Emily settled on the cabin porch, sharing slices of warm bread with butter and jam, the aroma mixing with the cooling air, a symbol of domestic comfort and mutual care. Luke's hand found hers across the wooden table, fingers intertwining naturally, a gesture that had grown from necessity to desire, from protection to affection. Emily rested her head against his shoulder briefly, allowing the ease of trust and shared labor to envelop her, the distant sounds of crickets and rustling grass underscoring the intimacy of the moment. Shadows lengthened and the first stars pricked the twilight sky as Luke brushed a damp curl from Emily's cheek, fingers lingering against her skin, conveying warmth and a gentle yearning. I'm glad here," she whispered, voice soft but certain, eyes reflecting the fading light. Luke's lips curved into a tentative smile, eyes reflecting the firelight from the hearth inside the cabin and the quiet satisfaction of a day spent building something meaningful together. Their faces drew closer, hearts hammering in a shared rhythm, breaths mingling with the cool evening air scented by pine and freshly tilled earth. In that pause, suspended between the fading sunlight and the rising glow of lanterns, they shared their first heartfelt kiss, tender yet full of promise, sealing a connection that had grown from fleeting glances, shared danger, and quiet moments of care into a bond neither could ignore. The kiss lingered, a punctuation against the vast, wild expanse of the frontier, affirming not just love, but trust, companionship, and the fragile hope of a home built together. As they pulled apart slightly, foreheads resting together, the prairie wind whispered through the fields, carrying the subtle scent of flowers and earth, symbols of new beginnings and nurtured hearts. Laughter bubbled again from Emily, mingling with the low murmur of Luke's approval. The two of them sharing a final glance toward the horizon, where twilight met the darkening land, knowing that the day's work, the shared labor, and the tender moments had planted more than seeds. They had sown the foundation of a life, of love, and of belonging, ready to flourish under the harsh but beautiful western sky. The horizon burned with gold and crimson as the sun began its slow descent, painting the dry creek plains in a fire that seemed to set the sky itself ablaze. Luke and Emily rode side by side along the familiar trail leading back to their small homestead, the wind tugging at Emily's skirts and stirring loose strands of hair across her flushed cheeks. The town was quiet, the air thick with anticipation, as if the prairie itself knew that this day would settle the ghosts that had followed them for months. Without warning, a shout rose from the ridge, a ragged, determined cry that carried over the wind and rattled their nerves. Luke's hand instinctively moved to Emily's, squeezing it lightly, a silent anchor of reassurance. Emily's pulse quickened, but she trusted the calm, steely determination in his eyes. The pursuers, desperate and weary, charged down the hill, but the couple, prepared and united, guided the horses with precision. Luke had anticipated their path, using fences, dips in the terrain, and quick, improvised barriers to slow the attackers. Dust exploded in clouds as the pursuers' horses stumbled over hidden rocks, and branches whipped at their faces, forcing them into disarray. Emily ducked behind Luke, heart pounding, and he murmured, "Stay close. We've got this." Their movements were synchronized, unspoken communication guiding them through the chaos, the rhythm of trust and necessity blending with adrenaline. One last attempt was made as a rider lunged toward Emily, but Luke intercepted with a deft sweep of the reins, spinning her horse aside and sending the threat crashing into the scrub. Silence fell, punctuated only by the snorts and stamping of horses, the dust settling like a curtain closing on the danger that had haunted them. The town, alerted by the commotion, emerged from doorways and saloons, watching as the couple returned victorious, sweat and dust glistening on their foreheads, breaths heavy, hearts aligned. Murmurs of admiration and relief rippled through the crowd, skepticism giving way to respect and quiet celebration. Emily slid from her horse, brushing mud from her skirts, and Luke's hand immediately found hers, gripping firmly, fingers interlacing with a warmth and assurance that neither needed to verbalize. Lanterns were lit along the main street, casting pools of golden light that flickered across wooden planks, illuminating the simple joys of home and community restored. Inside the cabin, the scent of bread, wood smoke, and wildflowers filled the air, a sanctuary of warmth and domesticity that contrasted sharply with the chaos left behind on the trails. Emily laughed, the sound rich and unrestrained, as she handed Luke a cup of steaming tea, their hands brushing in a gesture heavy with intimacy. Together, they repaired fences, fed the animals, and moved through the motions of daily life, with the ease of partners who had weathered storms both literal and figurative. As evening deepened, the two stood side by side on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the sky bleeding fiery hues into the plains. Luke brushed a stray curl from Emily's temple, fingers lingering in a tender caress that spoke of promises made and kept. Their eyes met, reflecting both exhaustion and the glow of something far deeper. Love forged in survival, trust, and shared vulnerability. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh earth, mingling with the warmth of lantern light spilling from the cabin, as if the universe itself had conspired to cradle their hearts. Emily leaned slightly into Luke, his arm moving instinctively to wrap around her shoulders, holding her close as the last streaks of sunlight faded. They spoke softly in whispers, sharing memories, dreams, and half-formed plans for a life together, each word an affirmation of belonging and hope. The night sky deepened, stars pricking the indigo canvas above, and they let their hands tighten in quiet unity, grounded in the knowledge that the frontier would always be wild, but their hearts had found a home. The distant murmurs of the town, now calm and accepting, drifted to them, But Luke and Emily were absorbed in their own universe of shared warmth, laughter, and whispered devotion. Their first full evening together in peace stretched like a gentle promise, each heartbeat a reminder of the resilience and love that had carried them here. They stood hand in hand, gazing across the plains where the sun had set, shadows fading and leaving only the promise of tomorrow, a testament to survival, courage, and the quiet, transformative power of love. As the wind brushed against their faces, Emily rested her head lightly against Luke's shoulder, and in the silence, the final question lingered like the stars above. Can love truly transform even the loneliest souls? The prairie answered with the soft rustle of grass, carrying hope across the wild, open land, and for the first time in months, both felt that it had.